Welcome to The Mountain in Us, a podcast where the journey gets its voice. I am Taran Singh, your host. Here we greet the thrills, jolts, ascents, and descents of our uncharted adventures. Hey, everybody. Today, my guest is Hannah Warren. She is a poet, translator, and a keen observer of life. She's author of the poetry collection Slaughterhouse of Old Wives and two chapbooks. Hannah is a creative force, beaming with originality, surprise, and stir. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited about what you're doing here with thinking about poetic journeys and how we get to our contemporary space in writing. Thrilled to chat with you.
Awesome. It's an honor to have you on the show. And today I want to explore the beauty and the connection power of a language. And before we go drill into language, I just want to know a little bit about yourself. You just recently moved to Irondale, Alabama. Can you just walk us through your early years and how does Alabama come to a stop in your journey?
Yeah, Alabama is a really weird stop in my journey that I don't think I ever expected. So I was born in South Mississippi in Jones County in this tiny town that no one has ever heard of, very small population, very few opportunities to engage with things like poetry because that was just not the concern of people who were living their day-to-day lives. So it wasn't until I went to college that I realized that poetry wasn't just Robert Frost, wasn't just Keats and all of those other dead white guys that we read in high school, but instead something that can be much more miraculous for a contemporary reader and writer. And so the first time I really engaged heavily with poetry was in Catherine Pierce's introduction to poetry course when I was in undergrad. Catherine is an excellent poet. Her most recent book is Danger Days. Highly recommend. But we read Natasha Trethewey in that class. She's been our national poet laureate. She was the poet laureate of Mississippi. Natasha Trethewey kind of changed the way that I thought about language and writing and what we can do with it because she was writing unabashedly about the place that she was from, which includes a lot of Mississippi. So she was writing about Louisiana, she's writing about Mississippi, she's writing about Georgia. These places that I thought didn't pop up in poetry because I didn't think that we were really allowed to write about our experiences like that. The only time I had ever really engaged with Southern literature was with people like William Faulkner. So this was outside of my scope of experience, and that was super exciting to me. So I started learning more about poetry, started learning more about myself. I followed that through and did a master's in fine arts degree in poetry and creative writing at the University of Kansas, where I learned a little bit more about the type of writing that I was interested in, and that fell within grotesque poetry with poets like Daniel Pafunda and speculative literature and what the weird and uncanny can do with writing. And I struggled for a little while trying to figure out how this applied to myself. I avoided writing about the South. I had finally left. I didn't want to deal with that part of who I was anymore. So I was writing about dinosaurs. I was writing about the prairie, but I wasn't writing about the place where I was from. Eventually, I moved back to Georgia to get a PhD. And that's when I started thinking about what the South meant to my writing again. And so I was confronted with all of these parts of myself that I had avoided. Like, what does it mean to be from South Mississippi as a poet, especially as a woman poet? And so a lot of my work now is especially Southern Gothic. I'm thinking a lot about womanhood in the Deep South, and I'm in Irondale, Alabama, doing a lot of that work still. So I'm engaging very critically with my eco landscape, with my natural and cultural landscape, and thinking about what those spaces mean to me. So I didn't expect to end up in Irondale, Alabama. I didn't move here for my own work. I just kind of landed here due to other personal circumstances. But it's been really, really good for my writing because I'm in this landscape that feels so fraught to me. I'm right outside of Birmingham. I'm only 3 hours away from the place that I grew up. And again, the closest I've been, I lived in Germany for a while, I lived in England for a while. I was as far away as physically possible, I think. And then somehow landed smack dab right back at the place where I began. It's been really interesting.
No, that's good. Irondale, Alabama, where poetry is going to be forged, right? So that's that is what it's going to
Yeah.
look like, right? What I didn't do that discovery on the name. Probably it has to do something with iron or dale. I do not know, but I think it's. I like how you said that there is so much in South, and that's part of the area that I have not visited that much in my life, and I'm going to explore it as I learn a lot more about history from my son who is doing American history right now. And I know you hosted a poetry reading at home,
Yeah.
and then in the world that we live, a lot of it is digital, and I just want to know how that idea came.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started a poetry series inside my house called Aesthetic Shock. And I'm thinking very deeply about the ways that landscape influences us. Because I'm here in Irondale with no prior attachment to this place, I really want to find a way to marry myself to this landscape in a new way. So I'm working on this Master Naturalist certificate right now. Alabama is the fourth most eco-diverse state in America, which no one knows. Because when people think about Alabama, they think about the Civil War, they think about a history of racism, they think about all the things that everyone thinks of when they think about the Deep South. They don't think about the fact that we have the most species of oak trees in America or more carnivorous plants than any other state in America. And so this place is really strange. And so I started thinking about how I could marry this ecological interest with poetics. And I called up some poets that I really, really love. One of them is local. Her name is Miriam Kaleha. She is a phenomenal Maltese poet who lives here in Birmingham now. Zach Anderson is right down the road in Tuscaloosa, writes a lot about Western landscapes. And my third person that I had was Stacey Balkin, who's this incredible poet out of New Orleans. And all three of these people are writing about landscape in a really, really fascinating way, either their current landscapes in the Deep South or the places they're from. And none of these people are from the Deep South, but because they've been here for a while, Zach Anderson was in Georgia and is now in Alabama. Miriam was in Malta and is now in Alabama. Stacey's from Jersey, but has been in the South for so long. All of them have the South bleeding into their poetics, and it's been absolutely phenomenal. And so all three of these folks gathered in my house and we talked about landscape for a long time. We had like a great audience of local poets and people excited about literature come and listen to these three folks just have a good conversation about what it means to write inside a specific space. So
Awesome.
that's my way of connecting a little bit more to this place I'm in now.
No, I was not aware of any of those things about Alabama. That I love trees, and I know you said you're going to be a master naturalist. You're doing your certification. We are going to bring you on another episode to talk about that. I think I feel the other way around. I was born in the mountains, and that's why I call it mountain in us. A lot of my life was seeded in the environment. I didn't have to discover myself. The environment made the discovery for me, right? And that,
Yeah.
right, and I was so lucky when I look back to be born and brought up in a place where the sense of mountains, the valleys, and everything around you makes you who you are, right? So I'm excited you're in Alabama. We're going to switch gears to your first book, your names that you have chosen for your book, Slaughterhouse for Old White Tales. How did that name came about? And also, while you tell us that story, please also go and the note to reader that you have in there. When I first read it, I thought, what am I reading? And I was like on a swing on a valley with no feet and no heart. Right? What a beautiful way to entice your reader to flip the page without skipping a beat in many ways. So both, I'm going to put it out there so you don't forget it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the title came after a long time. I started this manuscript when I was living in Kansas in that moment when I was trying to avoid writing about the South, but it just like kept coming out. So I was writing about the Natural History Museum that I spent a long time in on the University of Kansas's campus. This was another moment of me trying to connect myself with the landscape. I spent a lot of time in the prairie on 10-hour hikes. I spent a lot of time in the Natural History Museum. And so I was writing about all of these places. I was putting together a manuscript that centered around apocalypse and dinosaurs and inheritance and the things that streak across time and stay with us. And when I moved back to the South, I started thinking about the fact that I was avoiding putting myself in this book. And I started integrating more of the self, more of my personal experience. And that was really difficult to me. But I realized that a lot of my writing, in the way that I was weaving together personal experience and natural history, I was moving in a lot of these old wives' tales that we have in the Deep South that often say a lot about the ways that women are supposed to keep their bodies pure, right? The ways that women are supposed to avoid associations with the devil. All these things that are so inherently involved in women remaining this pure ideological concept for men's consumption. And so when I titled this book, I was thinking about how much I was trying to resist that inside this narrative. And so this title comes after a poem that's inside, but I wanted to get rid of some of these old wives' tales. The way they've passed down has been so harmful to women. And that's not to say all of them. So much of our good scientific knowledge is passed down through old wives' tales, women who know more about nature than we could possibly imagine. But also, so much of it is grounded in these patriarchal norms that don't quite serve us as contemporary women. And so that's where the name of the book came from, my hope to slaughter that. But I will go ahead and read the note to the reader that I have at the beginning of this book because it contextualizes that a little bit too. Note to the reader. I know there are ways to write poetry in which I ignore you entirely, but I've never been one for closing my eyes in the dark or sewing my lips in empty white churches. I want to part your mouth with my fingertips, to hear you whisper salt blood in my ear. I want us to say the words monstrous and safe and devil dark together. I want you to tell me your favorite dead thing. I tattoo your name on my wrist with saliva. I balance it on my tongue like duck fat. You. I have questions and maybe you can't answer, but I have to ask. On what root-heavy road does your ankle twist? How does it feel to spool sand behind your teeth? What do you invent when your bulbous flesh melts deep into swamp water? And so throughout this poem, I'm thinking really deeply about the landscapes that inform me, the things that I want the reader to bring into this text. And so, in combination with the title, I'm hoping people will read this text not as an instruction guide, not as a way to like manifest a specific type of self, a specific type of world, but a way to gain entry into the way that women have to navigate the sociopolitics of the Deep South in America.
Yeah, no, this is deep. I admire the courage, and I think in general, right? I think when society goes through upheaval, woman upheaval is so different than men upheaval because of just the power dynamics plays different. The children and women go through much more pain and much more bloodshed and much more, in many ways, bondage. And the only way to cover up sometime is you make them look sacred or make them look pure so that all sins can be raised. And I find that a kind of the human nature is that whatever is sacred is actually covering something that is dreadful in the habits.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sickness traditionally is associated with ungodliness. There's this great critical text called Purity and Danger, which is an anthropological text that looks at the way that various different cultures across the earth view dirt and plague and like what it means to be clean versus unclean. And so often across all of these cultural spaces, women are considered unclean by means of their body alone. And so it's not a specific time, it's not a specific moment. It's that women's natural state is unclean, and that's associated with evil and devilry and all these other things that make women second class citizens.
Yeah, you said pretty well in the note in the reader, swinging my lips in empty white churches, right? And
Mm,
right, and that is the story of us even today when I look around, right?
right.
And the poem that actually got my attention is the ampersand poem that you have. You hum quietly in your home. I just find that poem so resonating and so reflective, that you hum quietly in your home. In many ways, a lot of your internal cleansing is happening in that poem. How did that
Hmm.
poem came into being? But because I felt a vibe of, you know, of somebody demasking me from inside out, and pulling me apart and say, okay, this is how you need to think about connection.
Yeah, absolutely. That poem is part of a larger set called Estranged South. So it runs across quite a few pages. It's a big chunk of this book, and it forms a series of 12 or something like that interconnected poems. And I wrote those during COVID, which was such a weird time for me. So I was living in Athens, Georgia, when the pandemic started. And every single day, I was thinking about the various ways that we are socialized inside our like economic social spaces, and how during the pandemic we got this weird break from all that. So like all the normal gender stuff that we deal with on a daily basis kind of took a pause. So I mean, women were still having to stay at home with their children. There are so many things that were still happening that fell within normal gendered presuppositions, and like we know that women experience a spike in violence. But for me in my house, like because I was not going out and about inside academia, inside family spaces, my birth family is a very traditionally structured place in a way that my current house does not have. So my husband and I inside our home, the gendered expectations aren't there. But with my parents and my siblings, it very much is. And I didn't see them during the pandemic. And so I was doing a lot of reflection on that gendered space when I was absent from it all, because I was just either in my house teaching on Zoom, or I was out hiking in nature. And so all these things that I never noticed around me started becoming more important. I was doing a lot of just like weekend road trips, like day trips, and then coming back home. And in Georgia, there's this huge obsession with laying over history. So, like, they put this pretty patina over things. And so you'll find all of these monuments that look like just wooden structures, and then suddenly you'll realize that's where enslaved people were sold, and it's on a tiny plaque over in the corner. Or you'll go to something called the most beautiful hiking trail in Georgia, and it'll actually be part of the Trail of Tears, but you would never know unless you called this really tiny plaque over in the corner. And so I started thinking about the way that Georgia hides its own histories. I started to think about how we ourselves hide our own personal histories and started integrating them together. And this landscape that I thought was really familiar to me started feeling really estranged. And so it was this combination of being out and about, noticing things I never had before, and being completely separated from the normal code switching that I had to do all the time. So that's how all of this came together. The humming you're talking about is just this attempt to make sound in my house by myself. And singing is such a social thing, right? So singing is something I usually do with other people. I've been in choirs throughout my life, but all of a sudden it was just me alone in my home making sounds, right? I'm not with a group of other folks. I'm not doing anything in public. I am just singing to myself in my house. And I did that for months and months and months. I hummed as I thought about this patina landscape. I hummed as I thought about gendered expectations. It was just me thinking and making sounds.
Oh, thank you for writing that piece, and that hum is beautiful. Before I get to my next question, the line that also sticks to me: the town is a butcher's knife with no hand to wield it. That's the power that is so prevalent in the society, not just now, but it's always there, right? We might, and that's something that I am pretty aware of it. And I think for me, poetry is a way to challenge some of that power that exists, that can put silence to the lips, right? And that's what I use for myself. But I know you
Yeah.
jumped into poetry as an accident, right? And you shared that story with me, and I want to hear it again for our audience. And can you talk about how you ended up taking poetry seriously?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned Catherine Pierce earlier, who's now one of my great friends. But when I was in undergrad, I was determined that I was a fiction writer. Poetry was frou-frou to me. I didn't want to deal with it. Importantly, I had also not read a lot of poetry, which I think is true for everyone who thinks that poetry is not important. It's because you haven't read it. And I know from experience because that was me. But when I was young, I started out as a fiction writer. I took like an intro to creative writing class. And I remember the next semester, there wasn't a new fiction class available. And my professor, Becky Hagenston, who's also very lovely, was like, why don't you just try out this poetry class? It sounds like you'd like it. You're really into words. You write really beautiful prose. And I'm just like, I don't like it, but I'll do it. And then immediately fell in love with poetry because of people like Natasha Trethewey, because of people like Laura Glenham, because of people like Anna Journey, like all these people who are writing really cool language based poetry. I realized that you could find narrative inside poetry. And that's something that I had been looking for in short form that I didn't always find. And so I love the way that like linguistic interplay could work inside poetics in a way that it couldn't work inside fiction, at least not for me. And so I found something really freeing in the ability to write formless poetry that I could not find in fiction. And so I quickly fell in love with poetry, but it was a gnashing of teeth. I did not go willingly. Poetry was really annoying to me for a long time.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the beauty and power of poetry, that it pulls you before you know you've been pulled away.
Absolutely. And that's something that I tell my students a lot now because I teach intro to creative writing on the college level quite often. And that will be a combination of numerous different genres, usually fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And I always have quite a few students who are just like, Hannah, we do not want to do the poetry section of this. I am here for fiction. And I get to be like, wait, I was like this too. We're going to find poetry that works for you. Because one thing that people don't think about is that poetry has genres just like fiction does. I mean, whereas fiction will have speculative science fiction, crime, romance, literary. Poetry does all that too. People just don't read enough of it to find out which genre they like. And so usually I'll sit down with students and we'll figure out what genre of poetry are you interested in. If that's not Shakespeare and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, that's okay. We'll find you some Ada Limon. We'll read Terrence Hayes. We'll read Denez Smith. There are people who are doing such cool things in contemporary poetry, and I've never had a student who doesn't find something they enjoy.
No, and I think poetry is going through renaissance. Right? There's so many things that are, especially in the world we live today, where poetry does a great job of communicating, but also
Mm-hmm.
piercing through some of the fog that we collect over a period of time. And I know you moved to Germany to do translation work. How did that come into picture? Right? What attracted you towards the German language? And I also want to, and I've
Yeah.
never lived in Germany. So other thing that I want to know is, like my mother tongue is Punjabi. We use different word different ways, right? And English
Yes.
doesn't do that. English is very, nut and bolt language. Right, it is more, like a, right. So I also want to understand, your attraction for, for language, and how was living in Germany working on some of these translation projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So I moved to Germany to work on my dissertation, and I had absolutely no intentions of doing translation work. That was not within my scope. I do not have a background in translation theory. So I got there. I lived in Freiburg and Brisgau, which is in the Black Forest in South Germany. It's the warmest place in Germany. It was still very cold for this American Southerner, but that's completely fine. And I met a really, really great group of expats who spoke English from the United States, from Canada, from Britain, from Australia, who were all really interested in writing. And a few of them had a small interest in translation as well. And I was really interested in finding contemporary German writers who were doing something like weird in poetry. So, a lot of the poetics that I love from American and British authors and English in general do some grotesque work. They talk about bodies in a really strange way as a measure of resistance. And Germany, because it is the birthplace of the Gothic, has a history of doing really weird stuff with language. But I was just super unfamiliar with contemporary Gothic literature in Germany. And so I asked around, I found a few recommendations. I started reading so much German poetry, and I eventually found this poet that I fell in love with. Her name is Alexandra Bernhardt. She lives in Vienna now in Austria, but she is from around Munich. And so her work is absolutely phenomenal. She has this great book called Europa, translating that into English, where she talks about how the birth of Europe is not as homogenous as we think of it. So we often say, like, Germans are like this, the French are like this, Swiss are like this. And we have this stereotype that we place on all these people. But those places are tiny, right? Like Germany is the size of Georgia in the States. It would be like saying, people from Alabama are so drastically different from Mississippi. No, they're not. Like, that's not true. We have this shared landscape, these shared histories. And especially in Europe, everything has changed borders so often that people who grew up on this side of the German border with France would have been French 100 years ago. Like these things shift so often. And so in Alexandra Bernhardt's poetry, she talks about this Frankenstein version of Europe, just like a bunch of different body parts shoved together to make this whole that doesn't quite line up with our expectations. And she does that in super, super weird ways. And so, one thing that I love about the German language as someone who learned to speak it is that there are rules. Germans love little rules. See, I'm making like one of those stereotypes right now, and it follows inside their linguistic practices.
I thought
So
Autobahn has no speeding rule. Like that's the only rule I know.
but it's their rule that it doesn't, right? Everywhere else, very clear rules, except the Autobahn where they go wild. But inside Alexandra Bernhardt's poetry, she goes bananas with language. So everything is weird. She brings in Mittelhochdeutsch, which is this like middle high German. And the best part of translating her poetry is that I try to keep the sound of what she's doing inside English. And so I'll often find that I have to translate middle high German to contemporary German to English over to Middle English. And because German and English share so many linguistic backgrounds, sometimes those words are the same thing. And that is entirely infuriating and so, so fun. But in a lot of ways, I'm trying to find methods of repeating stylistic choices that she makes because German is a language of endings. And so the ending of a verb will change depending on the subject, etc. There are rhyme schemes inside her poetry that I cannot reflect in English because we don't do that. And so I'll end up doing so in some other method of trying to like create rhythm and sound throughout the poem. But in a lot of ways, translation has altered my writing practice just in the same form that it does when I read American poetry or any other English poetry. And that if you read a writer and study them for a really long time, you end up putting some of that stuff in your own work. So I'm learning new ways of framing language, but I'm also just thinking of new language quite often in English too, due to the translations. Alexandra Bernhardt uses the word Samen a lot, which can mean a few different things in German, but one of them is seed. And I've seen the word seed so often now that seed is popping up in my own writing in different forms. And it's been so strange, but really fun. And so translation theory just kind of altered the way that I think about my own writing in terms of how rhythm moves throughout my poetry now.
No, that's great to hear. Language itself, each language had its own beauty, and having
Yeah.
having done somebody else's work and then putting it definitely is something to be proud of. I want to know the book name again so I don't forget it.
It's Alexandra Bernhardt's Europaia. So Europaia. And it translates to something like Europa, like the Greek goddess.
Like I grew up in India where the language itself is more of you go from 30 miles here and there, the language can change, and some of it
Yes.
is so dramatic change that you have no idea what it is, right? And growing up, it was not a big deal, but now, and United States probably the most continuous land where only one language is predominantly spoken on the planet, right? I right, there's only English. You can survive with English coast to coast. And
yeah, it's really strange how everyone I've met from nearly any other country on earth speaks 3 to 4 languages, and Americans often speak one, maybe like 1.5 max, and that half's real shaky. But I think that changes the way that we think about others. It changes the way that we view alterity. I mean, if you can go 30 miles and you understand I am in someone else's space, there's a possibility they won't understand me. You have this self-reflection that is very un-American. Americans always expect everyone to know English regardless of where they go because it's the only thing they've ever needed. And so other places don't do that. And I think that's really incredible. And it's a generosity of understanding that allows you to rely a little bit more on body language and kind of struggling through. People in Germany were so nice to me when I first moved there. My German was so bad, and everyone was so incredibly kind, especially in like government offices where I was struggling through just trying to get like an ID for myself. It was so rough, but everyone was used to it.
Yeah, no, that's an experience to keep. And talking about books, you recently finished a manuscript and you celebrated in a very delicious way. Can you share that moment and anything from the manuscript, what genre it is, and do you have the title? Anything you want to share with us? Any sneak peek that you want to give our audience and me?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'm sending out a manuscript right now named Hurricane Pastoral, which has been so incredibly fun. It was my dissertation manuscript. And this is what I was working on when I was in Germany, thinking about the way that women navigate Gothic landscapes. And so, how do women in Southern Gothic landscapes, thinking about religion, thinking about sociocultural expectations, navigate those spaces versus how do women in Germany do this inside Gothic landscapes within very religious orientations as well? And it turns out that like we share a lot in common in a way that even other spaces in the States don't, because all of America is very Christian, very religious. But it's very intense in the deep South in a way that it's not in, New England. But when I was in South Germany, that same intensive Catholicism popped up over and over again, those expectations for women's bodies. And so I have a lot of comparisons between those spaces inside my manuscript. Hold on, I can pull one up and read it real quick.
Oh, that would be
Let me
good.
see what I got.
Hurricane Pastors, and that's
Hurricane Pastoral.
Pastoral. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
That's a great name.
Thank you. I am thinking about the history of the pastoral tradition, which is going out into nature and reflecting on yourself, but that's traditionally been something that belonged to like an elite upper class. And so I wanted to fuddle that a little bit by thinking about my own history inside a place that's ravaged by hurricanes, what it means to apply that to a landscape that is destructed over and over again.
I didn't know pastoral means taking a walk in the nature, and that.
Yeah, it's inside the eco-poetic tradition.
Yeah, I do it every day, so it has become naive, too naive for me.
Uh-huh, I know. All right, I'm gonna read a poem named Köln's Mirrors, and that's just the German word for Cologne. So it's a city in Germany that's known to be very Gothic. Köln's Mirrors. Tourist mouth perch cameras in the nave. The points are Gothic. It feels like an apology. I'm sorry we glimmer in this pulse point. I'm sorry we paid the Lord to see pinched jewels and marbled dead men. I press my palm, then my tongue to callous stone and feel war's grit. One stone angel on the flute, another on the extended horn. This Catholic shout, this painted leap. An old graveyard splits, square inside a square. Old, stone walls, spiked with quartz. New, chain link with roses woven through the diamonds. Rocks crushed from other larger rocks. Mountain to boulder to river stone to gravel. We inherit what we need. Inside my great grandmother was my grandmother, was my mother, was myself, and inside me is nothing. So when I was living in Germany, I did a lot of, thank you, Taryn. I did a lot of hanging out in graveyards and really old churches. And because I did not grow up in the Catholic tradition, and because my German is not quite good enough to understand everything happening in a Catholic church, I was kind of befuddled by everything. It didn't really touch me. Catholicism is a big question mark to me. I know what everything is intellectually, but the actual practice is just not something I'm that familiar with. And so I spent a lot of time just sitting in the back pews of Catholic churches writing because I was interested in the architecture. I was interested in what was happening inside in terms of Gothic art. But the practice itself was very odd to me. So it was this like estrangement that I got used to. But this was a poem that came out of that, thinking about my own history with Gothic landscapes in comparison to this new kind of culturally Gothic, kind of landscape Gothic space.
Even though you say Gothic, but I think even you can translate this to any space. It is how we attach to things that are
Yeah.
superficial, and when we attach them for so long, they're burdens more than anything else, right? And popular culture makes it even impossible to think about it, right? As something that you can get rid of. It's part and parcel of the fabric. Then I liked how it is inside me nothing, but I also like the mountains and the boulders, the stone crushed into stones. I know you celebrated this one with in your local cafe with a cake, so congratulations to you, and I look
Thank you.
forward to reading that book, and this will be fun. Before we put the mountain in us, this episode to closure, I wanted to see if you have anything to. I know you mentioned Danger Day as one of the books that one should read, considering the situation, the dawn that we live
Yep.
today. Danger Day makes a good book to read. Anything that you would last words for our listeners, especially books or anything from a creativity perspective that you want to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of books I have read recently that I think speak directly to our like current moment. And I'm over here looking at the stack of stuff that's on my desk right now. Rebecca Gale Howell has this awesome book named Render an Apocalypse that came out a few years ago. I want to say 2013. Yeah, it's this if you wanted to write down that title.
Yeah, I've read this book. This is the hog
This is
poem.
one of the ones I shared with you. Yes, we
Yeah,
have talked about this book before.
yeah.
I'm always thinking about that book. I am writing a critical essay right now on women's Southern Gothic poetry and the way that women do very odd writing about the grotesque inside the South. And that book has popped up a lot to me, but it also has this ongoing note about just apocalyptic happenings outside of yourself and also in your body. So when I think about apocalypse literature, I think about minor versus major apocalypses. So, what happens on a global scale versus what's happening in our own community, our own household. And that's a lot of what she's thinking about as well. Another highly recommended thing would be Gabrielle Bates' Judas Goat, which is absolutely incredible. It came out last year or the year before, but it talks about the hauntings of landscape as well. So if we're thinking about landscape hauntings, the way that all of our experiences, as you said, make us who we are, that one's a good one too.
Awesome. No, thank you. Thank you for those recommendations. I really loved Rebecca's book, and I have a hog poem coming in my upcoming collection. So it was good to
Oh,
see her poem, and I'd already written mine anyhow. But any other last words besides the book before we close this episode of Mountain in Us? And I'm sure I'm going to have you again for our more talk on nature this time. More on the oaks and the forest. That's a common trail that we all poets have to go through.
yeah, absolutely. I'll just say that like right now is a really good time to make art, like we're going through a very hazardous moment, and taking time to write down your experiences is incredibly important because we think about our voice as something that sounds like everyone else's, but each one of us has this response that is so different and unique. And I think each one of those is worth putting on paper and sharing with other people to see if it helps anyone. So, yeah, I think continuing to write and making sure not to fall into the depths of despair is really nice.
Yeah, well, I'll take that advice to heart. And this is awesome having you today. It was
Yeah, thank you so much. This was so
yeah.
lovely.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our listeners who are going to enjoy this beautiful conversation with Hannah. Thank you for joining us on the Conversation Trails of the Mountain in Us podcast. Each episode here is crafted with love, adventure, and reflection. We hope you have enjoyed this one, and we welcome your thoughts on it. And if you want to be on the show, feel free to reach out.